Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. Um, my cat Sophia, she has tapeworms. It's terrible. And I think they're tapeworms. I've collected two samples and, put them in sealed containers, Ziplocs. And the vet's closed today, but I'm going to take her tomorrow as soon as I can. Started seeing them last night. But the other two animals that I have here, Winchester and then my mom's dog, she's gone now, Shelby. My mom's dog went back to my mom. The one that's pregnant. They're fine. I've been checking their stool and they don't have tapeworms. I'm sorry that's probably really gross for most people to hear, but um, if there are like animal owners or caretakers or parents as students of mine, then you totally get it because it's just something you have to check. Um, I've heard that there's like over-the-counter medicine I can get her, but it. I haven't actually taken her to the vet yet since I rescued her. She's been fine, it seems, but I want to see what's going on with her and maybe get her some tick medicine if she got infected. And hopefully it's not hookworms. Hookworms would be super scary because she's an indoor cat. So, like, does my carpet have hookworms? Absolutely terrifying. Um, Happy November. I thought we were done with the spooky season. This is the lecture series on Dewey. The title should tell that to anybody listening right now, even though we haven't talked about Dewey yet, and we're almost 2 minutes in. Um, we're doing John Dewey's Artist Experience. So this is a more meaty um, overview of American pragmatism, not as a method, but as specifically John Dewey's theory. And it's a sort of aesthetic biological theory. It's a way of not unifying, but mediating or reconciling consciousness, art, experience, aesthetic experience, survival, strife. He really takes everything into uh, as an element in his theory or in his exposition. I'm hesitant to say he has a quote theory. I'm um, hesitant to call insights and embodied wisdom theories at all, but we will study these three chapters. And in these three chapters, there is a lot to chew on, a lot of questions to ask. That's what's difficult about pragmatism is because you couldn't necessarily boil everything he's talking about down into essential principles or anything. And presenting them that way would really miss all of the dynamism he has at play here. Um, I want to give you a brief overview of the chapters. It's about 60 pages. I think we can do it in one one 9 lecture series, right? Like I talked about before. Each of my base 10 series because Apple and Spotify don't allow decimals. So there's like a numbering system that I have to follow and I try to keep. Um, and really, if each lecture is 40 minutes to an hour and a half, then more than nine should be a separate unit or something. So as I record these, if for whatever reason we just start spending a lot of time on each chapter, um, then we'll have to break it up. But I think each chapter is about 20 pages, and I think it can read 10 pages an hour out loud. And the questions are in the order of the guiding questions are like in the order of the flow of the chapter, even though the flow is really all over the place. It's just how Dewey is. I mean, it's a really complicated. I've read this book so many times. You'll see in the annotations, well, I can show them to you in a minute, but I haven't read this whole book that many times. I read these three chapters a lot. Um, there's multiple colors here. It's the same annotations you'll see on the screen as we go, but I just thought I'd show you. And the spine is really worn, starting to rip there. So it's Perigee. It's pretty cool. The cover's really cool. I riffed off of this cover for the podcast art or the YouTube podcast art. So it's like a Technicolor version of it. or inverted colors, something. Um, and basically the structure of these three, we've already started to discuss, well, so the main question, like if you were to do your essay on this one, the question would be, the essay question would be, what is aesthetic experience? But that's not a simple answer, and it's not a simple question. There's, like I said, like 12 or 14 sub things under there. At one point, the guiding questions had these in it, so you may remember them. Um, you may have seen them or not, but either way, you should totally be prepared or able to do this. Um, One, because the James essay is an easier, not an easier choice, but it's a very reliable choice. It's a shorter choice if you're not confident. And two, because if you do the Dewey essay, I'm very likely to be more flexible with how you present it, but it should still make sense and it should still cover a few key strokes, like disintegration and consummation would be a big one. That rhythm back and forth between falling out of step with your environment and then overcoming that growth is really big for Dewey. Another big point in the essay would be the live creature. The live creature as an evolutionary biological ground for a commonality of that disintegration and rhythm, right? So the live creature really is the ground there. So you would probably start with the live creature and then go to the disintegration and consummation. You would also maybe do what Dewey does, which is in the first chapter, the first half of the chapter. The second half of the chapter is where he creates the live creature. And then he moves to the live creature in the second chapter. All right, first chapter, second half of that, live creature. It's like 10 pages. And then the second chapter, the next 20 pages, 20 through 40, roughly, are when Dewey connects the live creature with what he calls ethereal things. And it creates lots of continuums between supposed dualisms or dyads. And so we start to really see Dewey as a continuum thinker, meaning resolving traditional problems and historic, like not historical, but perspectival conflicts to show how he, at the end of one chapter, he talks about William James's analogy of birds perching and flying and perching and flying. And with that paragraph and with the whiteboards, we will look at how the opposites of things or supposed opposites, seeming opposites, are really always inflected inside of each other. So the coming flight is inflected in the perching. The activity you're about to undertake is inflected in the rest, is inflected in the mental, like maybe you have a problem on your mind until you sleep, and then the next day you do the solution. But that coming activity was dependent on the rest of the meditative sleep that produced the solution. And so there's an intercalation, there's an edge, dual, multi-aspect nature to a lot of the continuums that we work with. For example, doing and undergoing are seen as are rhythms of the same process. Rhythms are a big topic in Dewey because of these continuums, because of the dynamism of changing relations with the environment. Um, the literal meaning of the word environment is very helpful when so we have the live creature. The live creature is a first person perspective to start with philosophy, so everybody can be the live creature and start this philosophy for themselves. It's a first philosophy in that regard. It critiques the dualism of museums. Um, and from the first person, environ means to avail upon or to impinge upon or to surveil, not surveil, but to give itself or throw itself or force itself upon the perceiving subject. And quite literally, it environs upon the environment, environs upon the mental life. And Dewey's life creature is bound up with the interchanges of its environment, is what he says. Meaning there's no conceiving of this as like a Cartesian subject. There's no, um, that's the whole point of the disintegration is that the live creature has needs and wants and lacks, and it must fight, it must survive, it must find food, it must find shelter. Um, these define its nature, its essential nature. So he's not really he's somewhat doing existentialism, but just from the kind of he creates a sort of eidetics of the life creature. Um, and this is really apparent when he talks about the reciprocal relationship of form and matter or form and content, um, where the emerging form and content of the work determines the sui generis or one of a kind nature of that work. Artworks are languages for Dewey, and so there's a sort of language of the medium and a language of the color, of the feeling, of the texture, of the sensation in Dewey. He talks about the uniqueness of color and emotion. So the emotion is always bound up with the environment that it's interchanging with. The fear of failing a test is different from the fear of losing a family member or the fear of getting in a plane crash because you have a fear of flying. Or different from the fear of being caught, which is more of a projective fear that will like put itself in all sorts of places. Um, and then the color situation, there's the color of the red ball, like a red kickball that you had as a kid versus and that's it, it's the na I don't want to say the nature of the color or the quality of the color, but the relationality of the color. The color itself obviously is specific to that place on the object too, but it's specific in some sense to the light hitting it, all these other factors. And some of those factors are again affective from the subject, how it's perceiving it, what other fears are impinging upon it, whether loves are impinging upon it, what else is motivating it, what else is concerning it. So even the same object has a different experience for the life creature in different moments for Dewey. It's very flexible. It's very Spinozan. It's very affective, consonant with the other kinds of um, articulations of intuition and kenosis and dialectic and eidetics that we've discussed in this course, and Cartesian phenomenology, um, what we'll get to with Spinoza, sorry, with Sartre, sorry. There's a lot more that I've done that kind of keeps branching off from all this. But it's not relevant to what you would understand as a student in the class. All right. So we create the continuums. We have a uniqueness of language and color. The language and color really, the uniqueness of emotion and the relation of emotion into sense. In the chapters we have, we do see that emotion is a unifying thread. It's the thing that makes a perception coherent. So you associate elements, diverse elements from experience and in your perception, and they make sense together, quote unquote, because they're unified by a coherent feeling. And that feeling is some kind of emotion or something, but for Dewey, that's what emotion is. He says it has a kind of magical role in Winchester stop. It has a kind of magical role in synthesizing elements from diverse places and being unrestricted by spatial constraints, spatial and temporal constraints. Um, it's not really in our guiding questions, but a very, very important thing in Dewey, and especially in these three chapters, is that organization is not static. Organization means a harmonious integration of diverse living rhythms across multiple creatures and circumstances. So he criticizes silos of information or discrete categories of information or bureaucracies which have like chemistry doing its own thing and biology doing its own thing. And he says that some societies take these types of organizing. Dewey was a big figure in education as well. I don't, that's worth mentioning. He wrote like, I think he wrote like dozens of books or thousands of pages. I mean, it's kind of an insane output. Um, Very respectable. Um, but he's critical of these systems of organization in his educational systems organization. In his educational account, he advocates for experiential learning on the part of the students and constructivist learning, which is very pragmatist. Your beliefs have to be able to um, be tested and employed and refined, right? Because your truth has to be genetically or reciprocally fine-tuned and developed. Remember that truths and pragmatism are tools for further work. And Dewey describes the causal functioning of nature and the environment and nature um, as the basis for means and rationality or purpose-oriented reasoning in humans, like building a home or getting food. Not just humans, but other life creatures too, like beavers building a dam or anyway. I talked about this in the James episode, but it's worth re-mentioning here, and it's in chapter 2. Um, so I really haven't talked about the guiding questions yet. I've just kind of been discussing the main ideas of these really complex chapters. Um, in chapter 2, he finishes, or starts to deconstruct or remove the supposed discrepancies or distinctions between um, different dualisms. The chapter's called The Life Creature and Ethereal Things, and he shows how basically all of his simpler categories can be organized and refined into more specific things. So, like language is an organization and a refinement of the linguistic nature of matter itself. Formal language, like the words I'm using right now, and that's a refinement of perception and so that's why it's important to show that symbols are linguistically bound up, like a flag or a crucifix or some kind of religious symbol, a star, um, uh, the 5 Ks in Sikhism, the the hair, the comb, the knife. I forget them all, but these things aren't just the object. Um, this is not just a like a this isn't just a black tube. This is a pen. And you recognize it as a pen, understand it's a pen, and there's some kind of linguistic reasoning bound up in that. It's not just naming, and the language isn't the essence of it. It's the perception itself that we then refine into something more um, nuanced, something more nuanced. An example I like to give in a classroom was the brick walls, if we had them. Because you could look at the brick, if you've ever felt rough, coarse, red brick before, when you look at the brick, you'll like understand the evocation of the sensation of the coarseness in perception itself is significant and speaks to the cross-medial nature or the transmedial nature or the one medial, like the same that sense and language are bound up with each other. That one, all senses absorb each other is how Dewey puts it. And then two, that language is there too. And there are other continuums that he resolves, but we'll get into the details of that um, when we get to chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called Having an Experience, and an is in italics. An is the indefinite article. The an is significant and becomes a concept or a specific type of experience with certain contours or natures or relations. Um, the significance of the indefinite article returns to our Intro to Philosophy class and another text we read that is much shorter by Gilles Deleuze called Immanence a Life, um, which is for Deleuze, the indefinite article speaks to the immanent nature of life and the shared nature of life. One of those things being like the way that we lose our sense of individuality in in a moment of crisis to save whoever's in trouble. So we like get urgent and jump to the cause and help that person. Um, that speaks to our personal trans individual nature as a life, which is an indefinite conception. Um, in a sense, he maybe should have said a live creature instead of the live creature for Dewey, not Deleuze. We're going back to Dewey now. Um, in John Dewey's text, having an experience in chapter 3, I'm hoping that like once I kind of give the big rundown of the picture, we can start reading chapter 1, maybe get through we'll look at the guiding questions because we have good answers for them, for some of them. In chapter 1, I've added a few more, and then chapters 2 and 3, all the guiding questions have answers on the Instagram and the whiteboards. Um, having an experience. I mean, there's just a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, the doing and undergoing, um, a lot of specifics. Chapter 3 has 14 questions associated with it. He talks about how what it would mean for a stone rolling down a hill to have experience, having to have an experience. And this stone would have to look expectantly to its outcome, appreciate the helpers and the resistors along its way, be interested in them. All sorts of things a stone cannot do. It's like, I mean, there's no way I could just summarize all this stuff for you. But an experience are those memorable moments that have a start and an end, like that dinner, that meal, that fight with a friend. Um, they're synthesized by the emotional coherence of it. Um, oh, at the end of chapter 2, he references lots of other people like Keats and Shakespeare, Coleridge. I haven't read Coleridge. I don't know who that is. And Potter. I haven't read much Potter. I don't know. I think William Potter, Pater, Pater, was English essayist or critic or something. I've looked it up before, but I always forget. Um, yeah, he spends a lot of time in chapter 3 just kind of explaining the extremes that prevent aesthetic experience or an experience. So things being too rigid or too loose, things not being organized enough, or things being overly organized, overly separated, or too fluidly like non-distinguished. As I was saying before, his critique of organization, it's at the beginning of chapter 2. So it's not in that part with having an experience. But then he goes to doing and undergoing. He talks about what it would mean for that it would require for an aesthetic experience, an aesthetic, or Dewey explains that aesthetic experiences only happen and aesthetic objects or works that are capable of eliciting aesthetic experience in like-minded, not even like-minded, in other live creatures depend upon one, the artist perceiving as they're making so that they can refine it, and therefore two, the work itself determining the production of itself, which is fascinating. And so the work of like a lecture is being open and responsive to the different perceptions that can change its course. Um, this also brings us to the distinction between perception and recognition, where recognition is much like, sorry, let's pause. I was going to use recognition to explain recognition, which is not helpful. Perception is like I was just saying, whenever you can let a thing redirect itself because you're open. And even if it's similar to things you've experienced before, you take those past things and let them surge into the present perception with some energy or cross references or what have you. They supplement the new thing and still listen to where it might go. But in the instances where you use the association between a present thing and a past thing, um, to stop perceiving the present thing in order to save like mental resources or just because you don't care or something like that. And you reduce it to the past thing. And that's what he calls recognition. It's also what Bergson calls analysis. And so there's some associations between intuition and perception. But if I just say perception is intuition, then that misses all of those other things I just said. And we don't actually understand that intuition and perception both have to be a kind of present surging forth of new directions from past familiarities and past resources for new productions, new works, new arts, new tools, new instruments, new survival strategies, new sources of energy, new sources of care, um, new sources of stewardship, right? Okay, that's kind of, there's probably other stuff in chapter 3 that's worth mentioning at this level, but he talks about artistic thinking. He says that all experiences are simultaneously artistic, intellectual, and practical, meaning like useful or ethical, or material or instrumental. Um, Aesthetic, meaning emotional, and intellectual, meaning like theoretical or linguistic, or like mathematical or something like that, but also philosophical. Um, and he is adamant that that every experience is all three when you're going through the experience, and it's only after the fact you single out a specific prominent quality of the experience. It was mostly intellectual, it was mostly aesthetic, it was mostly practical. I was washing the dishes and I didn't think of anything, so it was just practical. Or I was washing the dishes and I was thinking of the meal we just had and I was putting it all together. So it's actually kind of aesthetic. Or I was thinking about I was washing the dishes and I was organizing my plans and refining my theories about something completely unrelated. So it was just intellectual. And there are other ways it could probably be intellectual. The point is, it's all three at the same time, and then you just start to separate it in reflection. Um, okay, that's kind of the overview on all three of the chapters. Um, let's look at the guiding question and get started reading. So for the first chapter, why are museums an unacceptable starting point for a pragmatist account of art and of aesthetic experience? Um, and we'll see some different parts of that. So why are works of art more than just objects, but are rather also an experience in themselves? And experience comes back as a backbone, meaningful, sturdy notion in chapter 3. How does mind-body dualism separate art from everyday experience and thereby estrange the live creature from intrinsic spiritual fulfillment? What role do museums play in this propagation of dualism? How do museums separate art from everyday life and reinforce mind-body dualism? So that's kind of like the first half of the first chapter, first 10 pages. And then the second half of the first chapter, we'll talk about the live creature and how do the rhythms of disintegration and consummation between the live creature and its environment produce aesthetic experience. And then sub question for that, why does Dewey turn to the live creature for the starting point of aesthetic experience and of a philosophy of art, where philosophy must be communicated via discourse, maybe a theory, maybe an experience or state of affairs, etc. 3. How does emotional sense and direct experience produce but also absorb intellectual linguistic symbolism? I think this one comes out more in chapter 2, but we start to see it somewhat. In what ways does this passage show that our actions and decisions are aesthetically motivated? insofar as our attention is captivated by aesthetic interests. Again, I think this also comes up in chapter 2, but Dewey, I think in chapter 3 actually uses the example of an interview, and he says that people who have been interviewed, most people in an interview, hmm, he doesn't say most. He says an interview happens, and the two people involved in this interview have been through lots of other interviews, so there's nothing new going on. Instead, we can't look to sociology or psychology to find something new going on, but we could look to a drama. We could look to literature to find a new novel experience. But also, he says that they've been through lots of these before, lots of interviews before, and by the end of it, um, the judgment of whether the person gets the job or not is ultimately a matter of whether the interviewer thinks the interviewee will fit in the role. That fit, that good fit, is the imagination of the interviewee's character with the necessities and functionings of the job. It's ultimately an aesthetic decision. It's an intuitionistic decision, but it's still aesthetic. It's still about the coherence of the perception, whether functional coherence, emotional coherence, um, consonance with other coherences, like overarching systems of coherence. How do you reconcile opposing perceptions, etc.? Sorry, I'm just playing with these lights I have right here. So we'll look at the other questions. You can look at them anytime you want, but we'll look at them together in the lecture once we get to chapter 2. And we'll see how far we can get in the book in this space. Briefly, our answers to, I don't have answers to the top level questions. I have an answer to the second top level question, but not the first top level question. But one of the sub questions used to be the top level question. So I just went a little bit above it to try to get to the very first kind of problematization or insight or motivation that Dewey starts with, a little bit more attentively to the text than I have in previous semesters, which was already supposedly really attentive. Okay, oh, we could read the preface. So Dewey wrote this, published in 1933. These were given as the William James lectures. I haven't even said that yet. 2 years before that, they were given at Harvard University as the William James lectures. So in the winter and spring of 1931, I was invited to give a series of 10 lectures at Harvard University. The subject chosen was the philosophy of art. The lectures are the origin of the present volume. The lectureship was founded in memory of William James, and I esteem it a great honor to have this book associated even indirectly with his distinguished name. It is a pleasure also to recall, in connection with the lectures, the unvarying kindness and hospitality of my colleagues in the Department of Philosophy at Harvard. I am somewhat embarrassed in an effort to acknowledge indebtedness to other writers on the subject. Some aspects of it may be inferred from authors mentioned or quoted in the text. I have read on the subject for many years, however, more or less widely in English literature, somewhat less in French, and still less in German, and I have absorbed much from sources which I cannot now directly recall. Moreover, my obligations to a number of writers are much greater than might be gathered from allusions to them in the volume itself. My indebtedness to those who have helped me directly can be more easily stated. Dr. Joseph Ratner gave me a number of valuable references. Dr. Meyer Shapiro was good enough to read the 12th and 13th chapters and to make suggestions which I have freely adopted. Erwin Edmund read a large part of the book in manuscript, and I owe much to his suggestions and criticism. Sidney Hook read many of the chapters, and their present form is largely the result of discussions with him. This statement is especially true of the chapters on criticism and the last chapter. My greatest indebtedness is to Dr. A.C. Barnes. The chapters have been gone over one by one with him, and yet what I owe to his comments and suggestions on this account is but a small measure of my debt. I have had the benefit of conversations with him through a period of years, many of which occurred in the presence of the unrivaled collections of pictures he has assembled. The influence of these conversations, together with that of his books, has been a chief factor in shaping my own thinking about the philosophy of aesthetics. Whatever is sound in this volume is due more than I can say to the great educational work carried on in the Barnes Foundation. That work is of a pioneer quality comparable to the best that has been done in any field during the present generation, that of science not excepted. I should be glad to think of this volume as one phase of the widespread influence of the foundation, the foundation is exercising. I am indebted to the Barnes Foundation for permission to reproduce a number of illustrations, and to Barbara and Willard Morgan for the photographs from which the reproductions were made. Um, I don't think my copy has any. Yeah, he has poetry in here. I don't think he has any pictures in here. Um, Foundations are cool. I recently watched the Foundation series, which is proprietary. Um, but it's based on Isaac Asimov's novels and series. The first novel is a collection of essays. I haven't read them, but now I want to. It's really interesting. And the purpose of the Foundation in that show is to kind of perpetuate humanity or protect important things. Um, but it's starkly different from the Empire, which is a very colonial, replicative process that is intolerant of difference. And Dewey is even critical of capitalism and colonialism in his first, maybe not as critical as he should be, but he is critical somewhat of these recent economic systems. My teacher many years ago made a point to emphasize the influence of the Barnes Foundation and Barnes on Dewey. The influence, maybe the prejudice of the visual focus in Dewey to the neglect of something like music. I ended up writing my term paper on music in this class. Um, Music's temporality makes it very difficult to catalog or describe, but it's worth doing, worth translating between mediums when possible. So here are the 14 chapters. If you want to pause the screen here and take a look at what they're called, can. I'll wait for a few seconds. We're reading chapter 1, the live creature, chapter 2, the live creature and quote ethereal things, as well as chapter 3, having an experience. And then I gave my presentation in the class that I studied this text. I gave my presentation on chapter 4, the act of expression. Um, because I was interested in language, affect, history, prejudice, and communication and aesthetics. And it worked really well. I mean, I took stuff from other things, other chapters. Chapter 6, substance and form, is where he literally says arts are a language. Um, because objects of art are expressive, they are a language. Rather, they are many languages. For each art has its own medium, and that medium is especially fitted for one kind of communication. Each medium says something that cannot be uttered as well or as completely in any other tongue. The needs of daily life have given superior practical importance to one mode of communication, that of speech. This fact has unfortunately given rise to a popular impression that the meanings expressed in architecture, sculpture, painting, and music can be translated into words with little, if any, loss. In fact, each art speaks an idiom that conveys what cannot be said in another language and yet remains the same. Language exists only when it is listened to as well as spoken. The hearer is an indispensable partner. The work of art is complete only as it works in the experience of others than the one who created it. Thus, language involves what logicians call a triadic relation. There is the speaker, the thing said, and the one spoken to. There's a fourth element, and Leah is hard. I think it's the rules of the discourse. The addressee, the addressor, the medium, and the message. So it's not the rules, but it's the rules can be medium. Um, the rules of a legal system can infect the intelligent or can affect and prohibit the intelligibility of certain claims of injustice. So under certain judicial systems, certain injustices are not recognized, understood, or heard. And that's a meaningful component um, of the thing said, the material conditions, and of communication. There are other aspects of it too, and it's really loose. I should probably, I mean, I actually want to do a series in the spring that involves the differend. That's from the differend, Jean-Francois Lyotard. The differend is about like a series of moving goalposts for what it would mean to hold the injustices of the Holocaust accountable, or any kind of injustice where there is a breakdown in communication such that the injustice is not recognized or meaningfully communicated. And this happens pretty much in any breakdown of communication as well as in any discrepancy of understanding between parties, not just in extreme cases like the Holocaust. It's a really complex text, really, really fun. Really depressing also, obviously. But it's just like a really, really creative, um, idiosyncratic text with a lot of rules still. The preface, he says, has like pretty much everything, and then the rest of the book is just him like chewing on other texts, other philosophers, critiquing them, telling stories from sociology about like narrative and myth. He goes through a lot of philosophers in that book. So, let's get started. Again, because I want to keep the whole series contained within 9 episodes, we're going to push these episodes to like maybe like 90 minutes, I think, and see how far we can get. So our first guiding question, how does mind-body dualism separate art from everyday experience and thereby estrange the live creature from its environment? Some of these answers are from students. If you see different colored answers on the whiteboard, they were an in-person student that I had, and it was like their exit ticket answer for that day. So it was like a daily work thing that was graded on accuracy. So one answer for this is that compartmentalization of life prevents aesthetic consummation and privatizes access to what should be a universal right to fulfillment. The spiritual is a refinement of the material in a living body. All these other ones that you see are from like 4 through 10, were later became the questions for chapter 2. In the first semester where these boards are from, we did uh, chapters 1 and 2 in the same week. And that's kind of happening now online as well. We're doing them all hodgepodge together, but that's better integration. It's not disorganization. That's organization for Dewey. Sha it's the same as something I was told about writing essays, which is that your introduction should know where your entire essay is going, and your first section should know where your later sections are going, and your later sections should call back to your first sections. So there has to be some kind of editing process where either you already know everything before you start writing, and it comes out as one flow. My preferred way is to start with the first section and then write the body from the top. um, write the conclusion with those insights from the body fresh on the mind, and then try to provide some kind of funnel or context into that whole thing using the introduction. So I always write my intros last. It works, but an abstract is something that you shouldn't write last. An abstract is a great thing to write first. An abstract is whenever they're kind of a difficult their particular beast, they state all the different arguments, why somebody should care about them, what your contribution is, and any other context you need or insights you draw in about 100 words, like 5 sentences, maybe six. Actually, sorry, I'm being particular. Um, it depends on this, the context. A lot of my abstracts for my 20-page papers are like 250 words. If the word count of the paper is like 6,000. But it just depends. Some publication venues or conference submission requests prefer really short abstracts. Some of them want synopses basically instead of an abstract where it gives a lot of the like details of the argument too. It just depends. But I find that producing an abstract as an independent entity, not as an introduction, can be a helpful pre-writing tool in trying to frame what your goals are and what arguments you can be working with to accomplish those goals. And then maybe following the body first rule to get to the conclusion and then the introduction. And then I like to use, um, I really got this in a class with professor at UHT, who said that he always just writes the parts of the body that he knows first, and then he fills in the other stuff later as he can. And I kind of do that with an outline, but I like to wait until I have the entire outline fleshed out before I start writing anything because I don't like to rewrite parts. So I like to have basically a phrase or a couple of different phrases on different lines for each paragraph. If you're working with a 10 to 20 page paper with multiple sections and multiple sub-arguments. This isn't Dewey particularly, but it's just helpful to know for writing. And if you're a student of mine, then you got to hear it at some point. And I don't really teach like a writing component necessarily, but we practice that through the different thinkers we have. So, chapter one, the live creature. First 10 pages, critique of museums, critique of dualism. By one of the ironic perversities that often attend the course of affairs, the existence of the works of art upon which formation of an aesthetic theory depends has become an obstruction to theory about them. So at this point, let's think about the question, why are works of art more than just objects, but are rather also an experience in themselves? For one reason, these works are products that exist externally and physically. In common conception, the work of art is often identified with the building, book, painting, or statue in its existence apart from human experience. Since the actual work of art is what the product does with and in experience, the result is not favorable to understanding. So that was the sentence that answered the question. In addition, the very perfection of some of these products, the prestige they possess because of a long history of unquestioned admiration, creates conventions that get in the way of fresh insight. When an art product once attains classic status, it somehow becomes isolated from the human conditions under which it was brought into being and from the human consequences it engenders in actual life experience. When artistic objects are separated from both conditions of origin and operation and experience, a wall is built around them that renders almost opaque their general significance, with which aesthetic theory deals. Art is remitted to a separate realm, where it is cut off from that association with the materials and aims of every other form of human effort, undergoing, and achievement. A primary task is thus imposed upon one who undertakes to write upon the philosophy of the fine arts. This task is to restore continuity between the refined and intensified forms of experience that are works of art and the everyday events, doings, and sufferings that are universally recognized to constitute experience. Mountain peaks do not float unsupported. So he's explaining that aesthetic experience has a continuity with regular experience and every other kind of experience. Mountain peaks do not float unsupported. They do not even just rest upon the earth. They are the earth in one of its manifest operations. It is the business of those who are concerned with the theory of the earth, geographers and geologists, to make this fact evident in its various implications. The theorist who would deal philosophically with fine art has a like task to accomplish. If one is willing to grant this position, even if only by way of temporary experiment, he will see that there follows a conclusion at first sight surprising. In order to understand the meaning of artistic products, we have to forget them for a time, to turn aside from them and have recourse to the ordinary forces and conditions of experience that we do not usually regard as aesthetic. We must arrive at the theory of art by means of a detour. For theory is concerned with understanding, insight, not without exclamations of admiration, and stimulation of that emotional outburst often called appreciation. It is quite possible to enjoy flowers in their colored form and delicate fragrance without knowing anything about plants theoretically. But if one sets out to understand the flowering of plants, he is committed to finding out something about the interactions of soil, air, water, and sunlight that condition the growth of plants. By common consent, the Parthenon is a great work of art. Yet it has aesthetic standing only as the work becomes an experience for a human being. And if one is to go beyond personal enjoyment into the formation of a theory about that large republic of art, of which the building is one member, one has to be willing, at some point in his reflections, to turn from it, the building, to the bustling, arguing, acutely sensitive Athenian citizens. So he's turning from the work of art to the people who made the work of art. With civic sense identified with a civic religion, of whose experience the temple was an expression, and who built it not as a work of art, but as a civic commemoration. The turning to them is as human beings who had needs that were a demand for the building and that were carried to fulfillment in it. It is not an examination such as might be carried on by a sociologist in search for material relevant to his purpose. The one who sets out to theorize about the aesthetic experience embodied in the Parthenon must realize in thought what the people into whose lives it entered had in common, as creators and as those who were satisfied with people in our own homes and on our own streets. In order to understand the aesthetic in its ultimate and approved forms, one must begin with it in the raw, in the events and scenes that hold the attentive eye and ear of man, arousing his interest and affording him enjoyment as he looks and listens. So things that captivate attention. The sights that hold the crowd. Let me see if we can answer. Maybe think about this here. How does emotional sense and direct experience produce but also absorb intellectual linguistic symbolism? We saw that in chapter 6, for sure. The sights that hold the crowd, the fire engine rushing by, the machines excavating enormous holes in the earth, the human fly climbing the steeple side, the men perched high in air on girders, throwing and catching red-hot bolts. The sources of art and human experience will be learned by him who sees how the tense grace of the ball player infects the onlooking crowd, who notes the delight of the housewife in tending her plants, and the interest of her goodman in tending the patch of green in front of the house, the zest of the spectator in poking the wood, burning on the hearth, and in watching the darting flames and crumbling coals. These people, if questioned as to the reason for their actions, would doubtless return reasonable answers. The man who poked the sticks of burning wood would say he did it to make the fire burn better, but he is nonetheless fascinated by the colorful drama of change enacted before his eyes, and imaginatively partakes in it. He does not remain a cold spectator. What Coleridge said of the reader of poetry is true in its way of all who are happily absorbed in their activities of mind and body. The reader should be carried forward not merely or chiefly by the mechanical impulse of curiosity, not by a restless desire to arrive at the final solution, but by the pleasurable activity of the journey itself. That was Coleridge. The intelligent machine engaged in, the intelligent mechanic engaged in his job, interested in doing well, and finding satisfaction in his handiwork, caring for his material tools, caring for his materials and tools with genuine affection, is artistically engaged. The difference between such a worker and the inept and careless bungler is as great in the shop as it is in the studio. Oftentimes, the product may not appeal to the aesthetic sense of those who use the product. The fault, however, is oftentimes not so much with the worker as with the conditions of the market for which his product is designed. Were conditions and opportunities different, things as significant to the eye as those produced by earlier craftsmen would be made. So extensive and subtly pervasive are the ideas that set art upon a remote pedestal that many a person would be repelled rather than pleased if told that he enjoyed his casual recreations in part at least because of their aesthetic quality. The arts, which today have most vitally for the average person, have most vitality for the average person, are things he does not take to be arts. For instance, the movie, jazzed music, the comic strip, and too frequently, newspaper accounts of love nests, murders, and exploits of bandits. For when what he knows as art is relegated to the museum and gallery, the unconquerable impulse towards experiences enjoyable in themselves finds such outlet as the daily environment provides. Many a person who protests against the museum conception of art still shares the fallacy from which that conception springs. For the popular notion comes from a separation of art from the objects and scenes of ordinary experience that many theorists and critics pride themselves upon holding and even elaborating. The times when select and distinguished objects are closely connected with the products of usual vocations are the times when appreciation of the former is most rife and most keen, when, because of their remoteness, the objects acknowledged by the cultivated to be works of fine art seem anemic to the mass of people. Aesthetic hunger is likely to seek the cheap and the vulgar. The factors that have glorified fine art by setting it upon a far-off pedestal did not arise within the realm of art, nor is their influence confined to the arts. For many persons, an aura of mingled awe and unreality encompasses the quote spiritual and the quote ideal. So this is another passage where we might look at the latter guiding questions for this chapter. How does emotional sense and direct experience produce but also absorb intellectual linguistic symbolism? And in what ways does this passage show that our actions and our decisions are aesthetically motivated insofar as our attention is captured by aesthetic interests? So that was also found in the like on looking of the fire, or this sort of like flow of perception, or this pool of attention, or this engagement, conscious pool of engagement, stream of consciousness. The forces at work are those that have removed religion as well as fine art from the scope of the common or community life. So Dewey is not being a religious, he's trying to put religious experience profusely back into everyday experience and all moments of existence for all life creatures. The forces have historically produced so many of the dislocations and divisions of modern life and thought that art could not escape their influence. We do not have to travel to the ends of the earth, nor return many millennia in time to find peoples for whom everything that intensifies the sense of immediate living is an object of intense admiration. Bodily scarification, waving feathers, gaudy robes, shining ornaments of gold and silver, of emerald and jade, formed the contents of aesthetic arts, and presumably without the vulgarity of class exhibitionism that attends their analogues today, like other kinds of uh, status exhibitionism or like wealth status displays. Yet in their own time and place, such things were enhancements of the processes of everyday life. Instead of being elevated to a niche apart, they belong to display of prowess, the manifestation of group and clan membership, worship of gods, feasting and fasting, fighting, hunting, and all the rhythmic crises that punctuate the stream of living. So with the continuum of disintegration and consummation, there is a sense of the Aristotelian mean. And I think it's in chapter 2 where Dewey makes explicit reference to Aristotle. and the mean. Dancing and pantomime, the sources of the art of the theater, flourished as part of religious rites and celebrations. And some cultures don't separate singing or dancing um, as different musical forms. Some cultures see them as the same musical form. Musical art abounded in the fingering of the stretched string, the beating of the taut skin, the blowing with reeds. Even in the caves, human habitations were adorned with colored pictures that kept alive to the senses experiences with the animals that were so closely bound with the lives of humans. Structures that housed their gods and the instrumentalities that facilitated commerce with the higher powers were wrought with a special fineness. But the arts of the drama, music, painting, and architecture thus exemplified had no peculiar connection with theaters, galleries, museums. They were part of the significant life of an organized community. The collective life that was manifested in war, worship, the forum, knew no division between what was characteristic of these places and operations and the arts that brought color, grace, and dignity into them. Painting and sculpture were organically one with architecture, as that was one with the social purpose that building served. Music and song were intimate parts of the rites and ceremonies in which the meaning of group life was consummated. Drama was a vital reenactment of the legends and history of group life. Leotard speaks to this with narrative, his discussion of narrative. Not even in Athens can such arts be torn loose from this setting and direct experience and yet retain their significant character. Athletic sports, as well as drama, celebrated and enforced traditions of race and group, instructing the people, commemorating glories, and strengthening their civic pride. I'm not sure why he includes race there, and that might not be the right word for it. And hopefully, if it is, then he's talking about ungrounded, what he sees as ungrounded. Obviously, it's always ungrounded. Um, and obviously, that's the race is different from culture, which you might have an interest in at least preserving, though not appropriating or colonizing or evangelizing, proselytizing. Under such conditions, it is not surprising that the Athenian Greeks, when they came to reflect upon art, formed the idea that it is an act of reproduction or imitation, what they call mimesis. And so we talk about the mimetic function too. There are many objections to this conception, but the vogue of the theory is testimony to the close connection of the fine arts with daily life. The idea would not have occurred to anyone had art been remote from the interests of life, for the doctrine did not signify that art was a literal copying of objects, but that it reflected the emotions and ideas that are associated with the chief institutions of social life. Plato felt this connection so strongly that it led him to his idea of the necessity of censorship of poets, dramatists, and musicians. Perhaps he exaggerated when he said that a change from the Doric to the Lydian mode in music would be the sure precursor of civic degeneration. But no contemporary would have doubted that music was an integral part of the ethos and the institutions of the community. The idea of art for art's sake, for art for art's sake. I think it's called l'art pour l'art, like the art for the art. Art for art's sake would not have been understood. Um, let's look it up. Yeah, l'art pour l'art. It's more of a Parisian thing. I didn't know it was the latter half of the 19th, so 1850s, well behind, 80, 50 to 80 years before this. They're at least 30 to 80 years before this. There must then be historic reasons for the rise of the compartmental conception of fine art. So here we see how Dewey's understanding of organization and separation, where organization is a harmony, an interweaving, an integration of diverse rhythms, a mediation of diverse rhythms. You could think of there's a function in mathematics, inhibitor function. No. Composite function? It's not called that. Interference pattern. Here. That's what I was thinking of. So it's not just like interweaving the different rhythms, but sometimes the agent who makes the frenetic decisions or uses wisdom to make the right decision, or has to attenuate the different energies and be receptive to lots of different processes that need to be sustained. Um, yeah, their energy becomes something more like this, which if they attenuate it properly, the composite function, whatever it's called, like the interference pattern, could be um, receptive to all the different modes simultaneously. It's a way of reconciling oppositions. Other examples, constructive and destructive interference. So you can cancel things out too. Whoa. All right, so try to keep the interference pattern in mind when we're talking about the organization of rhythms in Dewey. There must then be historic reasons for the rise of the compartmental, which is not organization, it is the separation of discrete rhythms or ideas or concepts that it's like a really analytic or analysis in Bergson's term. They just don't speak to each other like they should. Compartmental conception of fine art. Our present museums and galleries to which works of fine art are removed and stored illustrate some of the causes that have operated to segregate art instead of finding it an attendant of temple, forum, and other forms of associated life. An instructive history of modern art could be written in terms of the formation of the distinctively modern institutions of museum and exhibition gallery. I may point to a few outstanding facts. Most European museums are, among other things, memorials of the rise of nationalism and imperialism. So we can see here a sort of leftist critique of colonialism and domination. Uh, you know, it's not, he's critiquing both nationalist exceptionalism. So we see a sort of nationalism recently that's sort of, that is isolationist. That's still not what Dewey's advocating. Dewey's advocating for, well, nothing to, later he'll say that um, he's advocating for democracy and freedom. And he'll explain that the live creature and the disintegration and the consummation that makes art possible is also the ground that makes a democratic state possible, or a common shared understanding of what we need to survive, what we owe to each other, what we deserve, etc. Um, Still, democracy has to be enacted for Dewey. Uh, anyway, let's keep going. Every capital must have its own museum of painting, sculpture, etc., devoted in part to exhibiting the greatness of its artistic past, and in other part to exhibiting the loot gathered by its monarchs in conquest of other nations. For instance, the accumulations of the spoils of Napoleon that are in the Louvre, they testify to the connection between the modern segregation of art and nationalism and militarism. Doubtless, this connection has served at times a useful purpose, as in the case of Japan, who, when she was in the process of westernization, saved much of her art treasures by nationalizing the temples that contained them. The growth of capitalism has been a powerful influence in the development of the museum as the quote, proper home for works of art, and in the promotion of the idea that they are apart from the common life. The nouveau riches, who are an important byproduct of the capitalist system, the new rich, uh, have felt especially bound to surround themselves with works of fine art, which, being rare, are also costly. Generally speaking, the typical collector is the typical capitalist. For evidence of good standing in the realm of higher culture, he amasses paintings, statuary, and artistic bijoux as his stocks and bonds certify to his standing in the economic world. Dewey's ruthless about it. He's actually he's predating what Adorno will say similarly in critical theory about uh status signifiers and the decoupling of the cost of certain things from their production value, because this need to be better than other people with and spend more money on things as a show of a way of being better than other people um inflates the value from use value or production, what it costs to produce it, to what people are willing to pay for it as a way to dominate others. He shows that, I think, in 1939 in The Fetish Character of Music and the Regression of Listening. It might be 1936. And then one of my publications, hopefully I get more soon at some point, but one that I have, and I said I would cover it in an earlier lecture video, so I may go back and do that at some point. I still haven't done it at this point. But I discuss Adorno's argument there as well. It's it's a reification of value. That's the word I used, the word I was looking for that I forgot. The transformation of the inflation of use cost value into exchange value, which is exorbitantly higher and based on dominating other people and excluding them from access to things. Also usually as a way to motivate more labor out of people. Um, it's reification. To make something real that shouldn't be real, that doesn't unnecessary truth, a harmful reality that could be fixed. Okay, not merely individuals, but communities and nations put their cultural good taste in evidence by building opera houses, galleries, and museums. These show that a community is not wholly absorbed in material wealth because it is willing to spend its gains on patronage of art. It erects these buildings and collects their contents as it now builds a cathedral. And Dewey will make the argument that the sciences are properly only a handmaid into the arts. That's a question for chapter 2. And so ultimately it points, sciences are also a refinement of the arts. So they're on the same continuum as the arts, but the instrumental sciences, that more specific, refined, technical causal sciences, are just, again, more like refinements of another art. And in that sense, they're meant to enrich all of the arts together, where all of the arts together are meant to enrich aesthetic experience. It's not a practice or an object separate from the experience with it, the pleasure of the experience and the suffering of the experience. Do emphasize the suffering quite a bit. Um, I've been thinking of like cathedrals in relation to difficult accomplishments recently, like a trial of feats. I've been thinking of a cathedral of feats, but that doesn't make any sense because a cathedral is not. But it does kind of evoke this sort of severity of skill. These things reflect and establish superior cultural status, while their segregation from the common life reflects the fact that they are not part of a native and spontaneous culture. They are a kind of counterpart of a holier-than-thou attitude, exhibited not toward persons as such, but toward the interests and occupations that absorb most of the community's time and energy. So it seems like he's still critiquing these things. And he says it's the community that's at fault, but it's still a problem, I think. Modern industry and commerce have an international scope. The contents of galleries and museums testify to the growth of economic cosmopolitanism. The mobility of trade and of populations, due to the economic system, has weakened or destroyed the connection between works of art and the genius loci of which they were once the natural expression. As works of art have lost their indigenous status, they have acquired a new one, that of being specimens of fine art and nothing else. Moreover, works of art are now produced, like other articles, for sale in the market. Economic patronage by wealthy and powerful individuals has at many times played a part in the encouragement of artistic production. Probably many a savage tribe had its mecenas. Mecenas? I don't know the reference, and I also kind of resent the fact that he used the word savage, because there's like a whole history of prejudice and colonialism around that. So screw that. But now even that much of intimate social connection is lost in the impersonality of a world market. Objects that were in the past valid and significant because of their place in the life of a community now function in isolation from the conditions of their origin. By that fact, they are also set apart from common experience and serve as insignia of taste and certificates of special culture. Because of changes in industrial conditions, the artist has been pushed to one side from the mainstreams of active interest. Industry has been mechanized, and an artist cannot work mechanically for mass production. He is less integrated than formerly in the normal flow of social services because mechanical production can't be a organic, vital middle ground of aesthetic perception. A peculiar aesthetic, quote, individualism results. Artists find it incumbent upon them to betake themselves to their work as an isolated means of, quote, self-expression. In order not to cater to the trend of economic forces, they often feel obliged to exaggerate their separateness to the point of eccentricity. Consequently, artistic products take on to a still greater degree the air of something independent and esoteric. Put the action of all such forces together and the conditions that create the gulf which exists generally between producer and consumer in modern society operate to create also a chasm between ordinary and aesthetic experience. Finally, we have, as the record of this chasm, accepted it as if it were normal, the philosophies of art that located in a region inhabited by no other creature, and that emphasize beyond all reason the merely contemplative character of the aesthetic. Confusion of values enters in to accentuate the separation. Adventitious matters, like the pleasure of collecting, of exhibiting, of ownership and display, simulate aesthetic values. Criticism is effective. There is much applause for the wonders of appreciation and the glories of the transcendent beauty of art indulged in without much regard to capacity for aesthetic perception in the concrete. So, an overemphasis on like immaterial aesthetic experience as opposed to concrete aesthetic experience. In chapter two, Dewey will argue that there is no experience removed from concrete experience. The environment becomes a vehicle for the feeling, and the whole motion of the entire world, including your perspective with it, produces your feeling and your attention and directs alongside you what's happening. My purpose, however, is not to engage in an economic interpretation of the history of the arts, much less to argue that economic conditions are either invariably or directly relevant to perception enjoyment, or even to interpretation of individual works of art. It is to indicate that theories, like I said, I was critical of a theory, of calling Dewey's work a theory. It is to indicate that theories which isolate art and its appreciation by placing them in a realm of their own, disconnected from other modes of experiencing, are not inherent in the subject matter but arise because of specifiable extraneous conditions. Embedded as they are in institutions and in habits of life, these conditions operate effectively because they work so unconsciously. Then the theorist assumes they are embedded in the nature of things. Nevertheless, the influence of these conditions is not confined to theory. As I have already indicated, it deeply affects the practice of living, driving away aesthetic perceptions that are necessary ingredients of happiness, or reducing them to the level of compensating, transient, pleasurable excitations. So a sort of like settling, temporary, feel good excitement. Even to readers who are adversely inclined to what has been said, the implications of the statements that have been made may be useful in defining the nature of the problem, that of recovering the continuity of aesthetic experience with normal processes of living. The understanding of art and of its role in civilization is not furthered by setting out with eulogies of it, nor by occupying ourselves exclusively at the outset with great works of art recognized as such. The comprehension which theory essays or attempts, that's a use of the word essay in the verb form to try your best. The comprehension which theory essays will be arrived at by a detour, by going back to experience of the common or mill run of things to discover the aesthetic quality such experience possesses. Theory can start with and from acknowledged works of art only when the aesthetic is already compartmentalized, or only when works of art are set in a niche apart instead of being celebrations recognized as such of the things of ordinary experience. Even a crude experience, if authentically an experience, is more fit to give a clue to the intrinsic nature of aesthetic experience than as an object already set apart from any other mode of experience. So that is the answer to why does Dewey turn to the live creature for the starting point of aesthetic experience and of a philosophy of art? What's the answer? Even a crude experience, if authentically an experience, is more fit to give a clue to the intrinsic nature of aesthetic experience than is an object already set apart from any other mode of experience. Following this clue, we can discover how the work of art develops and accentuates what is characteristically valuable in things of everyday enjoyment. The art product will then be seen to issue from the latter when the full meaning of ordinary experience is expressed, as dyes come out of coal tar products when they receive special treatment. Many theories about art already exist. If there is justification for proposing yet another philosophy of the aesthetic, it must be found in a new mode of approach. Combinations and permutations among existing theories can easily be brought forth by those so inclined. But to the mind, the trouble with existing theories is that they start from a ready-made compartmentalization or from a conception of art that spiritualizes it out of connection with the objects of concrete experience, separates it from the vehicle, the necessary concomitant vehicle that you share your life with. The alternative, however, to such spiritualization is not a degrading and philistinish materialization of works of fine art, which is what he'll argue. He'll argue in chapter 2 that the material is sacred, but a conception that discloses the way in which these works idealize qualities found in common experience. Were works of art placed in a directly human context in popular esteem, they would have a much wider appeal than they can have when pigeonholed theories of art win general acceptance. A conception of fine art that sets out from its connection with discovered qualities of ordinary experience will be able to indicate the factors and forces that favor the normal development of common human activities into matters of artistic value. It will also be able to point out those conditions that arrest its normal growth. Writers on aesthetic theory often raise the question of whether aesthetic philosophy can aid in cultivation of aesthetic appreciation. The question is a branch of the general theory of criticism, which, it seems to me, fails to accomplish its full office if it does not indicate what to look for and what to find in concrete aesthetic objects. But in any case, it is safe to say that a philosophy of art is sterilized unless it makes us aware of the function of art in relation to other modes of experience, and unless it indicates why this function is so inadequately realized, and unless it suggests the conditions under which the office will be successfully performed. Makes us aware of the function of art in relation to other modes of experience, how art relates to the rest of our lives, and not our lives, but other experience, all of our experiences, sticking within the understanding that we are never outside of experience. And unless it indicates why this function is so inadequately realized, so the critique of the compartmentalization, and unless it suggests the conditions under which the office will be successfully performed. We get a lot of this in chapters 2 and 3, but there's a ton more after the rest of the book that we don't cover and that I don't know. The comparison of the emergence of works of art out of ordinary experiences to the refining of raw materials into valuable products may seem to some unworthy, if not an actual attempt to reduce works of art to the status of articles manufactured for commercial purposes. The point, however, is that no amount of ecstatic eulogy of finished works can of itself assist the understanding or the generation of such works. Flowers can be enjoyed without knowing about the interactions of soil, air, moisture, and seeds, of which they are the result, but they cannot be understood without taking just these interactions into account. And theory is a matter of understanding. Theory is concerned with discovering the nature of the production of works of art and of their enjoyment and perception. How is it that the everyday making of things grows into that form of making which is genuinely artistic? How is it that our everyday enjoyment of scenes and situations develops into the peculiar satisfaction that attends the experience which is emphatically aesthetic? Similarly, how is it that we take on a sort of empathetic perspective and concern for like a TV show, sometimes even kind of losing the boundary between like our investment in characters we care about or a book or something? How are we able to, and I have a paper in the making that's far from finished, kind of connecting Lugonas's world traveling as empathetic perception and loving perception with Michael Dufresne's aesthetic perception and the world of the aesthetic object. How do you go into the world of the aesthetic object? So how is it that our everyday enjoyment of scenes and situations develops into the peculiar satisfaction that attends the experience which is emphatically aesthetic? So in other words, how does any perception become a sort of like focused transport into the world of the aesthetic that we're experiencing? These are the questions theory must answer. What is the continuity of that mental experience, faculty, capacity, perception, whatever? The answers cannot be found unless we are willing to find the germs and roots in matters of experience that we do not currently regard as aesthetic. Having discovered these active seeds, we may follow the course of their growth into the highest forms of finished and refined art. It is a commonplace that we cannot direct, save accidentally, the growth and flowering of plants, however lovely and enjoyed, without understanding their causal conditions. It should be just a commonplace that aesthetic understanding, as distinct from sheer personal enjoyment, must start with the soil, air, and light out of which things aesthetically admirable arise. And these conditions are the conditions and factors that make an ordinary experience complete. The more we recognize this fact, the more we shall find ourselves faced with a problem rather than with a final solution. If artistic and aesthetic quality is implicit in every normal experience, how shall we explain how and why it so generally fails to become explicit? And why is it that multitudes art seems to be an importation into experience from a foreign country and the aesthetic to be a synonym for something artificial? So we'll start with this next paragraph in the next video, but I want to read this first sentence of the next, there's a section break here, but I want to read the first sentence of the next section in chapter 1, which is the last 7, 8, 10 pages, something. We cannot answer these questions any more than we can trace the development of art out of everyday experience unless we have a clear and coherent idea of what is meant when we say normal experience. And so then we'll go to the live creature for that understanding of normal experience, the back and forth, the survival. Speaking of that, my stomach is growling and I am ready to eat a little bit of food while this video processes. It takes maybe like 10 minutes for Zoom to uh for Zoom to convert the meeting recording into um a video file and an audio file that I then upload to the respective places. So we'll get that done. I'll get a little bit of food and we'll keep recording about 90-minute chunks. So far, so good. I think maybe the next episode we could even get like maybe through chapter two with it as well. Keep it down to like 3 minute or 3 episodes. That'd be crazy, but maybe not as daunting for my students. So once Dewey clicks, the rest of it kind of unfolds, and it's really interesting and fun to follow along with, and it's very enriching to see all the details that he offers to us. That'll be it for this video, guys. Thank you for your patience and for being here, and I appreciate any grace. Um, I try to offer as much as I can and try to be welcoming. I'm sorry if, I don't know, I think my hair looks bad, and I think there are things I'm forgetting, and I think I'm not as chipper and upbeat as I could be, but thank you for being here. Take care.